based off a print by Posada, who's a famous Mexican printmaker, but taking it into the contemporary, which was looking at some anti-immigration regulations that were going through the House a few years ago, right? Looking at this figure kind of as the INS, or what was the INS, but it's not ICE, right? Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So my work is looking at history, it's looking at other artists. If I learned nothing else in art school, I went to art school for a year and then dropped out, thought I could do some other things and then went back to university. But if I learned nothing else in art school, is that all art is about other art. So pay attention in those art history classes, because in fact you'll realize that the best art is art that is referencing and paying attention to the world around them, to the so-called longue durée of history, right? All of these things. The worst art is art that someone thinks they make kind of in the studio by themselves, right? And so me, I'm always thinking about and looking at history as a way to influence my work. Let me just show you these prints, and feel free to take. I brought a stack, so you can take one of these when you go. One of the projects that Josh McPhee does, one of my collaborators and collective mates in Just Seeds, is he organizes, or we could say curate, that's the word that people use these days. He curates this series of posters called Celebrate People's History. And it's a series of posters that he has different artists, he asks artists to make them, that look at various different radical or marginalized or often forgotten historical events, individuals, situations around the world. And so 2 years ago I made this one. I've made 3. I have one that's coming out on the Pueblo Revolts. I mean, we're here, 1680, if you know the history of kind of Spanish colonialism in the area, it's an era in the Southwest. In 1680, right, the Pueblos kind of under the leadership of an individual Copé, basically kicked the Spanish colonial regime back to what is now El Paso, and changed the situation, the relationships, the colonial relationships between native and settler peoples, right? So I have one forthcoming on that. But what I made 2 years ago is on the Flint sit-down strike. And if people know the history of labor, I live in Michigan, grew up in Michigan. Michigan is historically a very strong union state, although if you look at what's going on in the state, you wouldn't know that. The state's kind of in economic turmoil, there's no jobs, But in 1936 and 1937, workers at a plant, an automotive plant, the Fisher Body plant in Flint, basically struck. They decided to strike, and what they did was they actually stayed in the factory, stopped working. And it changed the face of union organizing and the way that workers and owners related to one another. And so I decided to look at that, but instead of telling the story, which is often a story that was very predominantly men and white men who were doing it, I decided, because there were women involved, there were black workers involved, I decided to look at the story of this individual here, Roscoe Van Zandt, who was a black worker involved in this. So if you want to take one of these, feel free. They'll just be sitting up here somewhere to look at. So that's kind of, in terms of my print work, it's looking at history and bringing history into the present, right? Realizing that the past is not somehow forgotten, that it's in fact influencing and informing what we're doing now. So you have the work of mine that is, very traditional art-based. It's illustration, it's graphic work. But as a contemporary artist who also writes fairly frequently, I have a bunch of book chapters and other essays coming out, 2 books which should be out in the next few years, that I see my entire life as all interconnected in my world as an artist, right? I don't somehow disconnect my work, which could be called in the studio, from my work in the classroom, right? So the collaboration with folks here during this week is not that much different from what I'm doing with students at Michigan State. Is not that much different than what you'll see in this video when I'm collaborating with urban Native kids in and around the Great Lakes. But all of these parts of my life are very much wrapped up in the whole of myself as an artist, right? My, what could be called quotidian activities, just the boring daily shit that I do, right, are all intertwined with who I am and what I do as an artist, right? And I think that's some of the things we have to think about and deal with when we think about ourselves as artists, and specifically once you finish school. So what I want to do now is I want to screen this 16-minute video, which tells you a little bit about this what I call my lowrider bike project, which is part of what's happening here. But it's an ongoing project that I've been doing in collaboration with various groups around. I grew up into bikes. I grew up into hip hop. I grew up in the woods, but I mean, you don't have to necessarily separate those things. We're kind of in a rural area here. But in 5 or so years ago, Jenny Western, who's a curator in Canada, organized a show which was myself and I think 4 other native artists making works about bicycles. And I'd always been into bikes, but I never had seen a connection between my artistic practice. It's like I rode bikes, I made bikes, I was into them, but it was somehow different. And with that, I started thinking about the connections and the real relationship between bicycles and art and that sort of stuff. So I made a lowrider bike for that show. It was really popular. It was a show in Canada. It was really popular. I made some prints about bicycle wheels, which incorporated some language stuff. And then I made kind of my version of Duchamp's ready-made with the bicycle wheel and the stool. People paid attention in our history class. And so I made my version of that. And from that point on, I just been thinking about these connections between bikes and my work. And through that, in the summer of 2010, I got a grant from the National Museum of the American Indian to do some research on indigenous forms of transportation in the Great Lakes and into the prairies, where my family's from, but also where I live now, and then take that information. So I was in residence at the National Museum for 2 weeks in DC and in Maryland, took that information that I had learned back to my community, and then engaged in this 6-month-long project. I worked for 4 months with high school kids to build 5 bikes, and then this intensive 2-week process during a summer camp for middle school kids to make the other remaining 2 bikes. And so I'm kind of in this thought and in this kind of idea of collaborating and engaging in making bikes that the bikes are works of art, but the collaboration and the process of building them is also integral to that, right? So it's important that when we're working, the 15 or so artists that I'm collaborating here with, but it's important that we're in the gallery, right? We're not somehow in a studio and then pull them into here when we're done. And in fact, that all of us working this entire week has been part of the work. And the bikes themselves, as you know, you can ask those working on them, and you'll see tomorrow when we get the stuff done, that each of the bikes becomes a manifestation of a specific historical event or organization or individual, right? And so how do we work through that? So let me screen this video, and then I'll just talk a little bit about the work in here, and then we can engage in conversation. Does anyone have any questions right now while I'm kind of standing here or squatting here?